Haven't done much commenting on the news lately. There's actually a reason for that. It's not that I don't care, because I do care about what's going on in the news. It's just that as I study more things and as I learn more things, well, I run into the paradox of knowledge. There's a great line in the movie The Vinci Code, where T-Bring says to Sophie, "Can you know a thing and never say it again?" And I love that line because it's indicative of the idea that keeping secrets, while it's important in some things, it still reflects the idea that knowledge changes you. You have to act on that knowledge. You cannot know something and not have it affect how you think or how you act. Even if it's secret, it affects how you think and how you know. When you know something, you have to use that knowledge somehow or another. It has to affect how you think. It has to affect how you act. And this is, of course, the learning of history. Or learning history, you learn things that change how you see things, especially as we talked about this week on Constitution Thursday, when you begin to see that this is something that changes how we understand things. When all of a sudden we have that knowledge, we have to look at things differently than we did when we didn't have that knowledge. We looked at the world of Cato, and we didn't get into a lot of it. I wanted to, but we didn't. But in one of the books that I'm reading, there's this paragraph, and I want to read it to you. Cato's world was the Roman Republic, a state at the apex of its power, able to make foreign kings tremble with a single degree, and rotting from the inside out. Cato's arena was the Senate, an awesome assemblage of gray-haired eminences, the symbol of the Roman Republic's heritage, and a body crippled by personality politics, rigged elections, ritualized bribery, and sex scandals. Public life in the late Republic resembled a soap opera, and if we didn't find in that fact a sharp enough reflection of our own time, we could surely find familiarity in the grave challenges that threatened Rome and its Senate. Those included homegrown terrorism, a debt crisis, the management of multiple foreign wars, the fraying of conventional social bonds and mores, and a yawning gap between rich and poor. This is how corrupt the Roman Republic had become, even as Cato stood in its final days, trying to salvage it from the tyranny that the dictator Julius Caesar would become. It's a fascinating study in history, folks, and I can't emphasize this to you enough. You can't read this stuff and then go read your newspaper or watch your morning news and look at it the same. You just can't. I can't listen to political ads anymore without hearing the arguments between Cato and Caesar, both the original versions and the Federalist and Anti-Federalist versions. It's remarkable to me. And yet at the same time, what do I do about it? That's the problem that I find. It's going to affect how I vote, I can tell you that. It's going to affect how I talk about things. And while I haven't been discussing the news lately on this show, it will change how I do that. Because when we have that knowledge, when we know these things, we can't look at things the same way. We just can't. There are two stories in the news yesterday and today that I wanted to briefly talk about, because I want to give you an example of how this changes perhaps how you see things. The first story, of course, is the story of one Alex Jones. Alex Jones, as you know, is in the news because of the $956 million in damages that he now has to pay to those victims, parents of the victims, the people who sued him for his actions post Sandy Hook. Again, not talking about what you think about the story, talking about the story as a whole. The other story in the news, of course, is the issue of Donald Trump being subpoenaed by the January 6th committee, which Liz Cheney's comments yesterday were that she wants to hold Donald Trump responsible for this, which really sounded a lot more like she was griping because she lost her election. But that's, again, how we look at things. These two particular stories, Alex Jones and Donald Trump, are really emblematic in a lot of ways of the issues that I'm talking about here. What do you think about those stories right now, today, before you consider something? It says more about you than it does the actual story. You follow what I'm saying here? If you had the understanding of things that perhaps Cato the Younger had, even Julius Caesar had, or perhaps George Clinton or Alexander Hamilton had, you might take a step back on these stories and reconsider them just a little bit. I'm not saying your opinion is going to change. It's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, however, is that it's possible that you might see something else in the story that causes you to reconsider some things. What do I mean? Both of these stories are being presented to us as First Amendment arguments. These are arguments under the First Amendment. Free speech, which is fine, but it's important for us to keep in mind that there are exemptions to freedom of speech, and we all know this. Sorry, had to slide the camera slightly. We all know that there are exemptions to free speech. We're all, of course, familiar with the you can't yell fire in a crowded movie house example, which is a bad example, but be that as it may, the Supreme Court over time has categorized a group of exemptions to free speech, the first of which is fraud. Now, these are in no particular order. Actually, they are in a particular order, but only because I put them in that order. The first exemption is fraud. You cannot fraudulently say whatever you want to say just because you have free speech. Now, you can say things that are lies, but if you defraud somebody because of that, well, that's a crime. It's called fraud. This goes back to the stolen valor argument. I can say that I won the Medal of Honor, and theoretically, as long as I don't make any money from doing so, I can continue to do so. I would personally never do that, but, there are people who have. The second is obscenity, which is bizarre because, again, nobody knows really what obscenity is, but they know it when they see it. Can't tell you what it is, but I know it when I see it. Prurient interest and all of that. We'll just go on from that one. Child pornography makes sense. It falls into the same obscenity exemption. Fighting words. These are words that cause fights, physical violence between people. If I say something that riles you up to the point where you take a swing at me, is that protected by free speech? Not according to the court. Threats kind of fall into this same category. If I threaten you, that is not free speech. And then we get to two of the most important ones. Defamation. I cannot defame you and then hide behind free speech protections. Now again, it's a fine line. What is defamation? What does that mean? Where is that coming from? What are we talking about? Really, when we get to that, defamation is defined as the action of damaging the good reputation of someone. We call this in legal terms slander or liable. Again, maybe it is when you're into that damaging the good reputation of someone. That's a vague, very gray area, isn't it? What if their reputation isn't good? How much more could I damage it? One of the great lines from news radio about Joey Buttafuoco. Like we could damage his reputation any more than he already has. But then you've got to get into intention. What did I mean to do when I said what I said about them? See where the problem lies? The eighth exemption is, of course, incitement. If I incite someone to something, I am advocating for the use of force when it is directed or inciting or producing when it is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action. And then the great Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes added to that, it represents a clear and present danger to society as a whole. Now, I want us to consider for just a moment two of these definitions. We're thinking about these two stories. I'm not saying that you should change your opinion about the story, nor am I saying you're wrong about it. What I'm saying is, here is some information, some data, which might be useful to your consideration. Incitement is the advocacy of the use of force when it is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action. If there is no advocacy for the use of force, is it incitement? And when you're looking at defamation, the action of damaging the good reputation of someone, slandering them or libeling them. If I say that someone is doing something, and I know that they are not doing that thing, simply saying it because gets me publicity or clicks or sells goop, am I acting in a manner that damages the good reputation of someone else? Moreover, I would consider the question of fraud in that one. I would consider the question of whether or not I'm doing so for the intention of financial gain. And if I am defaming someone for the purpose of financial gain, doesn't that meet the definition? When we look at both of these stories, it is remarkable to me because we tend to look at these stories through the prism of our own politics. I'll just say it. You voted for Donald Trump. You think that this is all about that. If you think that if you didn't vote for Trump, if you hated Trump, you think it's about something else. It's less about the legal definition of the word. It's less about what actually happened than it is about who you hate, who you listen to, I guess, is kind of what I'm saying. And in that world of Cato that we talked about earlier, in that world of the last days of the Republic, and indeed in the era of Cato the Anti-Federalist, we read those remarkable words: beware of those who wish to influence your passions and to make you dupes to their resentments and little interests. Beware of those people. Don't listen to them. Beware of them, because they are trying to make you the dupe to carry out their actions, much as Julius Caesar had done in the late Republic. He essentially bought off people, that corrupt Senate. And as he accused Cato of doing, in the sense that Cato was trying to badmouth Julius Caesar. And you had these passions that they needed dupes. They had resentments towards one another, and they needed dupes, and they needed people interested in their tiny little interests, which had nothing to do with your happiness at heart. It had to do with their power. It's remarkable that Cato the Younger, the original Cato, used to teach on a regular basis, consider it the greatest of all virtues to restrain the tongue. As we watch what's happening in these two particular stories, Donald Trump being subpoenaed and Alex Jones being found liable for $956 million, does the virtue for us lay in screeching about whatever our particular position is on this? Or does it lie in restraining our tongue? Because both of these stories represent something, don't they? They both represent someone else's passion, someone else's need for a dupe, someone else's resentments and little interests. And when we live in that world of Cato, where the fraying of conventional and social bonds and more, our lives resemble a soap opera, where we have politics that's crippled by personality politics, rigged elections, ritualized bribery, sex scandals, so forth, a yawning gap between the rich and the poor, and so forth and so on. When we live in that same world that Cato and Caesar lived in, is it not incumbent upon us, now that we understand some things, to step back and say, is this really about holding someone accountable? Or is it really about power and the maintaining of power and the gaining of power by people who want to play their passions, using us as their dupes for their little interests and their little resentments? Really just about their power? Or is it about our liberty? Because they're trying to gain power over you, both sides. And is that power going to increase your liberty or decrease your liberty? Much as we've been told, every nation, every generation, every society faces that same exact choice, metaphorically speaking. We face the choice, and do we decide to follow Cato or Caesar, tyranny or liberty? And I submit to you that now that we know something, now that we have taken the time to consider some things about what's going on in the news around us, it cannot help but affect how we think and how we act going forward. For once we have knowledge, we can no longer be blissfully ignorant, can we? And while most of history has chosen Caesar over Cato, we will have to decide for ourselves whether we will be the dupes, petty interests and resentments, whether we will choose to be ourselves, not be those people's dupes, because they do not have, none of them, our happiness, our liberty at heart. And it would behoove us to not pretend to be blissfully ignorant anymore, but rather to use the knowledge that we have and choose Cato, choose liberty.